Welcome everyone online, and thank you for joining the PIM webinar today. My name is Frank Place. I'm the director of the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets, or otherwise called PIM. Today we're going to hear about agriculture mechanization in Africa, lessons learned from South-South knowledge exchange. This work is undertaken by PIM as part of our agricultural growth and rural transformation research flagship. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. He is Hiroyuki Takeshima, who is a research fellow at the Development Strategy and Governance Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI. Dr. Takeshima has conducted research on market participation, transactions costs, agricultural technology adoption, biodiversity, and political economy of seed policies in Africa south of the Sahara. His recent research also focuses on the linkages between market and climatic risks and farmers' investment, roles of modern production technologies such as irrigation, mechanization, fertilizer, on agriculture transformation in sub-Saharan Africa. Hiro earned his PhD in agricultural and consumer economics at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in 2008. So we welcome him. But before I hand over to Hiro, let me explain how we will proceed on this webinar for those of you who are joining for the first time. So our speaker will begin very shortly with a presentation that you will see on your screens. The presentation will last for about 30 minutes. During the presentation, we invite all of you to send in questions via the chat and/or question windows that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screens. We will collate the questions and group any that are similar in content. Once we are in the Q&A session, our speakers will address the questions that we're able to pose in the time remaining. We are handling the questions in this way to make the best use of the 1 hour we have together. We are also recording the webinar and will make it available on our website shortly after the live event for those unable to join us now or would like a replay. So with that, let me hand it over to Hiro.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this webinar this morning. As introduced, my name is Hiro Takeshima, Research Fellow of IFPRI. Today's webinar will cover agricultural mechanization, the work that we have conducted under PIM over the last few years. Before I start, I would like to emphasize that this work builds on the collaborative work with various internal and external researchers that we worked with. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank their contributions. And I also would like to thank Dr. Shinshin Dell, who unfortunately could not participate today due to other urgent engagement for overall guidance throughout the course of this work. I'll first provide a background and then summarize the highlights of the work compiling experiences in mechanization in Asia and Africa. And I will briefly describe the highlights of policy engagements we had with African government officials in agricultural mechanization sectors and key policy outcomes that we have observed. And lastly, throughout the webinar, I'll indirectly highlight that the agricultural mechanization is actually part of the broader theme of the issue of private investment for rural transformation. Let me start with how the mechanization have spread in Asia. The figure on the left shows the percentage of cultivated area prepared by tractors in various Asian countries. And I also included Nigeria as an example of Africa. And this figure is based on various sources, and which is why I did not include the source here. And the figure are also of various reliability. So this figure needs to be interpreted with caution, but I wanted to show this to give us a better idea of when exactly mechanization or tractor use had spread to what extent in Asian countries in the past. And you can see that countries like Thailand had fairly high tractor use already in the 1970s and 80s. The other Asian countries have seen a substantial growth of mechanization use from the 1980s afterward. And during this time, the level of tractor use in countries like Nigeria have pretty much stagnated. The figure on the right plots the relationship between the tractor use and the share of workforce employed in the agricultural sector in the same set of countries. And interestingly, in Asia, many countries have seen the growth of tractor use, while a large share of workforce has remained in the agricultural sector. And this is particularly so in countries like India and Vietnam. And again, in Nigeria, similar decline in workforce in agricultural sector share has occurred, but the mechanization growth has not taken off. But this does not mean that things have remained the same since the 1980s in Africa. One example is the level of farming system intensification, which is often an important precondition for the rise of demand for mechanization. The figure on the left shows what we call R value, which essentially measures the share of agricultural area that are actually cultivated in any given year. So for example, the R value of 0.3 would indicate that 30% of agricultural area was actually cultivated in that year. The higher this ratio is, the more intensified the farming system is in the country. Now, the whole of Africa, this R value intensification has increased relatively slowly over the past few decades, but in regions like West Africa, this ratio has increased substantially since the 1980s. And in a handful of countries, such as Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, Tanzania, this index has increased sharply since the 1980s. So you can see that the condition in terms of farming system intensification has changed considerably in parts of Africa since the 1980s. And as I indicated earlier, the figures on the right show that at the same time, the share of employment in agricultural sector in these African countries have declined consistently because of the difficulty in obtaining accurate measure. I'm showing the figures from two sources, but both sources indicate that this pattern has been consistent. And thirdly, throughout the PIM activities, we also conducted a number of empirical analysis, many of which have been published in peer-reviewed journals, mostly focusing on the impact of mechanization. Basically, we found that mechanization, where adapted, has been a key driver of technical change in returns to scale in agriculture, which shifted a comparative advantage from smallholders to larger farmers. But land and labor market imperfections have prevailed, and because of that, smallholders have still remained mostly in the agricultural sector. But where smallholders have remained in the agricultural sector, mechanization still has helped income growth among these smallholders, and this has been particularly strong where they had access to higher yielding varieties. So that is the background that the mechanization had grown considerably in Asia. The farming system has also intensified in Africa, and mechanization, where adapted, has tremendous significant impact for farm household level as well as for rural economy. Now the question is, why is there a gap between Africa and Asia? And we now move on to looking at some of the factors that we have observed through the synthesis of the work compiling experiences in Asia and Africa. As I mentioned, this exercise builds on the collective work we conducted with internal and external researchers. We started with four scopes. First, a historical evolution of mechanization in the respective countries, and we looked at demand side factors, supply side factors, and where possible, we also looked at the effects of mechanization on agricultural transformation that were observed. We covered 8 Asian countries, 4 from East and Southeast Asia, and 4 from South Asia, and we also covered 5 African countries. When doing this exercise, we followed the following guiding framework. We first started with literature on the demand for mechanization, which are the farming system intensification and induced technological change, combined with increasing off-farm employment and rising rural wages. But we also recognize that the contribution of our work is to focus more on the supply side issues. We recognize that these factors, farming system intensification and induced technological change, will create demand for mechanization, and supply will respond to rising demand over time, but with the time lags and transition cost. And the role of public sector is exactly to mitigate these transition period, partly through South-South knowledge exchange that we can offer to African countries. And just to summarize what these framework are, farming system intensification basically suggests that the population growth and urbanization that would lead to rising demand for agricultural products, lead to shortening fallow period and growing demand for a more intensive tillage, which leads to the important precondition for mechanization growth. The seminal work by Pingali and others in the 1980s basically suggested that at that time, farming system intensification in Africa were insufficient. But as we saw in the earlier slides, these conditions have changed. And induced technological change would suggest that in response to changing labor-land ratio, mechanization as labor-saving technology would respond to increasing off-farm employment and rising rural wages and resulting labor scarcity. But there's the supply side would respond rather slowly because of market failures, particularly for the supply of machinery hiring service. Due to indivisibility of equipment, limited spatial mobility, seasonality of demand, and coordination failures, and other knowledge-related barriers. So let me first highlight the major aspects of experiences in Asia. With the interest of time, I will only highlight a few major ones, but for those who are interested, this webinar presentation will be available after the webinar, so you can check which ones I have left out. First, we realized that the demand for mechanization at an early stage really was raised through technological improvements and farming system intensification in Asia. Those were sometimes due to the improved varieties, high-yielding varieties provided by the public sector that would raise the returns to more intensive tillage. And oftentimes, when the tractor was just beginning to spread, the use of intensity of animal traction use had already reached a sufficiently high level, oftentimes much higher than where Africa is today. So they already had enough farm power used on the farm, which could readily be substituted for tractors. And at the later stage, the demand for mechanization were further raised by more economy-led factors, including economic growth, rise in wages, and industrialization. Now, in Asia, subsidies were often provided, but unlike in Africa, they had relatively small distortions because subsidies were often competitive and provided without targeting particular types of beneficiaries or equipment. And credit were often provided by a variety of private sector agents, including machine sellers and dealers. That also commercial banks were able to provide credit using land use right as collateral. And also, in many Asian countries, the local manufacturing started from simple tools such as spare parts, then moved on to relatively more sophisticated tools, attachments, and then eventually the manufacturing of machines. Now we move on to mechanization growth experience in Africa. First important aspect of the experience in Africa is that there is a significant heterogeneity and mechanization growth. There are pockets of areas with rising adoption, although the national level adoptions have remained low. The figures on the right indicate some examples from Ghana, Nigeria, and Tanzania. Tanzania's work is based on Dr. David Kahan's work, and you can see that the adoption rate varies considerably across regions within the country. And in addition, in Ethiopia, while the national level adoption is only 1%, the higher adoption has been observed in the southeastern part of the country, where wheat barley system is dominant and tractors are increasingly substituted for draft animals. Similarly, in Kenya, the adoption has been growing in tropical highlands and coastal lowlands. What are the other demand side factors for Africa? First, Dr. Vince Wanger's work confirmed basically that in Africa, the population density and improved market access in the last 3 decades have really induced a major shift to permanent cropping, which created the conditions for more frequent tillage. But at the same time, we have also seen increasing heterogeneity and farm size within African countries. There are a number of smallholders whose farm size have continued to decline, but at the same time, we have seen the emergence of medium-scale farms, and the nature of demand for mechanization differ between different types of farms, and understanding the nature of demand is increasingly important in Africa. And thirdly, many parts of Africa, including West Africa, have seen rapid urbanization leading to the declining movement of workforce from the agricultural sector. But urbanization in Africa has often happened without industrialization, including agro-industrialization, and consequently, it has not been associated with mechanization growth in agricultural sector. We also observed that while demand for mechanization is high for the first few units of a farm power use, they seem to decline rapidly at intensive margin. For example, there's a high demand for first tillage, but they decline rapidly for second or third tillage. There is also relatively low demand for multifunctional use, and these seem to have implication on how to aggregate demand to attract the service providers. What are the supply side factors? Number of market and government failures have limited supply responses where demand has emerged. First, high horsepower, expensive tractors are still common in Africa. And this is not only in terms of the difference between two-wheel tractors in Asia and four-wheel tractors. Even when compare four-wheel tractors, those in Asia are of lower horsepower and cheaper, while those in Africa are more expensive. So the issue of indivisibility and the limited mobility of machines are more relevant in Africa today. They limiting the access to mechanization service. And this has been exacerbated by the fact that the little commercial credit has also been extended by dealers, banks, or for tractor purchase, in contrast to Asia, where a lot of commercial credit has been provided by these private sectors. The issue of spare parts and attachments availability are well-known issues. The difference between Asia and Africa is that even for the manufacturing of relatively simple tools like spare parts and attachments, such manufacturing have not yet taken off in Africa, in contrast to Asia. There are also knowledge constraints, especially insufficient knowledge of tractor operations that are still constraining in Africa, especially among those new service providers who were selected by the government. And lastly, the government in Africa often faced challenges in identifying efficient market service providers to support. And let me elaborate a little bit more on the last point. One of the studies looking at the service providers, tractor owners in central Nigeria, identified two types of tractor owners. One is the market source tractor owners who obtain tractors from competitive markets without subsidies, and the government sourced tractor owners who obtain tractors from the government with subsidy. And comparing these two types, we observed that the market source tractor owners are consistently more efficient in providing service to more areas, to more customers. And this was so even when considering the seasonality, they exhibited considerable seasonality in demand and machine use. But even within the lean season, the market source tractor owners were able to meet demand and meet more demand and provide a service. And overall, they have earned higher profit, basically earning more revenues while spending pretty much the same cost as the government source tractor owners. So what are the key strategies for Africa? There are a number of strategies, but here I highlight only a few of them. The first is really to allow liberalize importation of machines, to allow the importation of variety of machines, tractors of various brands and horsepower. For example, in Tanzania, the government tried to inspect all the imported tractors, but our experience in Asia suggests that the cost of doing so might be higher than the actual benefit in terms of reduced availability of certain types of machinery in the country. Similarly, Ethiopia restricts access to foreign exchanges and put in place more requirements for licensing and import duties waiver. Again, lifting these restrictions are likely to lead to net gains in terms of more availability and of tractors or machines of greater variety of brands and types. And secondly, relating to earlier slides, government can really allow markets to select more efficient service providers or machine designs instead of them trying to select these types of service providers by themselves. And thirdly, oftentimes the subsidies are still needed, but if subsidies are used, they should be used to increase rather than limit the exposure to more brands types of equipment. For example, the past concessional loans provided in various countries often required equipment parts to be imported from the specific donor country. And having greater variety of imported brands and types of machines often provide more ideas for local stakeholders for local adaptation, which will eventually lead to the growth of local manufacturing. The government can also provide a number of public goods. R&D to develop and adapt locally appropriate machinery can be done in collaboration with domestic private sectors. The government public sector can also provide critical knowledge that the private sector can use, including the local soil conditions, the performance of different types of machines, and suitable plow depth, tractor horsepower, and others. The government can also invest in other complementary technologies in rural infrastructure that would broadly make mechanization more feasible. The public sector can also play a role in providing critical coordination. For example, in China, the local government linked combined harvest owners and customers in various regions. They also helped coordinate among migratory service providers. They also provided various information, including harvesting calendars that these service providers can use when deciding which regions to travel. And the public sector can also utilize local institutional mechanisms such as farm-based organizations, cooperatives, to promote local coordination in crop planting and harvesting timing, which would help group of smallholders to aggregate demand that would attract the service providers to come to their areas. And then lastly, I would also mention that the solutions will still differ within countries and across agricultural systems. Now, let me briefly highlight the key policy engagements we had with African government officials and the key policy outcomes we observed, using examples of the study tour in Bangladesh and the case of Ghana and Nigeria. Under PIM support, we organized a mechanization study tour in Bangladesh in November 2015. This was done with a collaboration with Bangladesh consultants as well as a summit. 9 officials from 4 African countries participated in this study tour. The team visited government, machinery importers, manufacturers, dealers, spare parts distributors, and farmers, and agricultural machinery research institutes in Bangladesh. After the study tour, the government officials compiled their reflections in 2 policy briefs. Here are some of the highlights of their reflections. First, they recognize the potentials of small tractors. They often observe the great multifunctionality that these small tractors and power tillers exhibited. They also thought that there are areas in their African countries where soils are suitable for small tractors to be used for plowing. They also recognize that even the four-wheel tractors, when they were used for haulage, transportation of bricks, sands, and those non-farm products, they were using lower horsepower four-wheel tractors, which could potentially create a market for similar smaller four-wheel tractors in African countries. They also recognized that the private sector were providing various types of services to tractor buyers, addressing certain market failures. Many of the importers and dealers provided after-sales service with warranties, which would provide maintenance and repairing service for the limited time period. And importers and dealers also often provided credit to tractor buyers. They also actively engaged in demonstration and advertisements of available equipment to sensitize the potential customers and had extensive networks throughout the country. The government officials also observed that the level of tillage was quite intensive. They saw that in many areas, several rounds of tillages were done on a single plot, as the yields often responded well to each round of tillage. And they also observed the significant investments into R&D and extension capacities. And the human capital level and skill levels of staff at these institutes were also quite high. And lastly, they recognized that the mechanization in Bangladesh has grown despite still weak standardization and regulatory capacities. Also, under the PIM project, we had engaged with the government officials from Ghana and Nigeria and observed how the work had helped them reform their agricultural mechanization related programs. In the case of Ghana, Ghana has been implementing Agricultural Mechanization Service Enterprise Center, AMSEC, since 2007. The phase one of this program started in 2007, but they had selective application requirements and often faced with low machine utilization, high breakdown damage due to improper operation and maintenance, and high default rates. In 2016, the government of Ghana secured a new concessional loan facility from Brazil and started phase two of AMSEC. In implementing the phase two, they partly incorporated various recommendations made by international agencies, including IFPRI's work. They applied less selective application requirements, also exploited the multifunctionality of tractors by providing various complementary equipment. They also focused more on the importance of maintenance and repair activities. The program now provides free scheduled 1,000-hour technical tractor maintenance service. They also included mobile workshops that were set up with subsidies but are run by private individuals. They also requested Brazilian manufacturers to provide spare parts for 2 years. And for first-time buyers of tractors, the government made it mandatory for them to participate, and the government provided training. Similarly, in Nigeria, a new program called the Mini Mobile Mechanization System is being launched, making use of smaller tractors such as power tillers, particularly targeted toward the youth. And power tillers are expected to be used for plowing, transportation of light machines, and the government officials in charge of designing this program told me that their participation in Bangladesh study tour helped them see the multifunctional use of the power tillers, which encouraged them to develop this program. And the other government official who participated from Kaduna State in Nigeria also told me that the Kaduna State has now shifted from subsidized distribution of tractors to more market-oriented approach, where the government now focus on linking farmers associations and tractor supplying companies to better communicate farmers' demand to these suppliers. To conclude, public sector play critical roles in generating and transferring knowledge on mechanization, and Asian experiences can offer much knowledge to Africa. International and intercontinental perspectives provide inform how mechanization have grown, or sometimes even though some constraints have remained unresolved, or inform which constraints had been actually resolved by the private sector. So the public sector can prioritize which type of support to focus. But also, it told us that it is important to more accurately understand the Asian experiences as well through closer look at the historical data in Asian countries. The research also contribute in significant areas. For example, the smallholders still remain in agricultural sector for the time being, and understanding the determinants of mechanization spread among these smallholders will remain very important. And also understanding the mechanization and the future of smallholders are likely to be relevant for many developing countries, including Africa. And lastly, understanding the role of mechanical technologies on agriculture rural transformation will continue to be an important area of research. And lastly, as I indicated in the beginning, agricultural mechanization is considered an outcome of private investment for rural transformation. Private investment has played a major role in mechanical technology development and supply. This is in contrast to biological technologies, where the public sector has played a major role. And growth in agricultural mechanization reflects increased capital to labor ratio in the rural and the overall economy, physical capital formation, but also the development of capital markets in the rural areas. And lastly, mechanization growth reflects the growth of rural non-farm economies, because one form of rural non-farm economy is occurs through backward linkage with the agricultural sector, and tractor hiring service is one such example. So understanding the mechanization issue offers insights into understanding the broader issue of private investment for rural transformation. So before I finish, I would like to also acknowledge the various external and internal contributors who contributed various country case studies, and also the government officials who participated in the Bangladesh study tour, and the research staff that helped us synthesize the Asian African experiences. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Hiro. That was very interesting. We have a number of questions that have come in, and I think they might still be coming in as I'm talking, but let me group a couple of them together, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. There were a couple questions that came in, and I also had just to maybe further probing the adoption of mechanization. So one question is, you showed quite a bit of variation within the countries that you studied in Africa. Does the variation that you show in Tanzania, places like Tanzania and Ghana and Nigeria, do they actually support the hypotheses that you have about those could be areas with higher land labor ratios, higher wages, perhaps more favorable cropping systems? So that's one question from on the Africa side. On the Asia side, there was a question that came in. They were noting that the rates of use of mechanization kept increasing and still remain very high in many countries where average farm size is shrinking. So the question was, why does mechanization still, why is it so popular and used so widely, even when the farms are shrinking in Asia? So one on Africa, one on Asia. So I'll start with those two.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Frank, and thank you for those who addressed these questions. Regarding the question on Africa, yeah, based on my observations, I think they are, in a large sense, they are consistent with the hypothesis of, based on the demand theory, that a lot of the demand for mechanization is related to the factor endowments. So the area with relatively larger farm size have seen more growth of mechanization adoptions. And in case of Nigeria, the pattern of difference is largely explained by, for example, in the northern Nigeria, the adoption difference seems to be explained by the wage rate. The central Nigeria is high, the wage is higher than the northern Nigeria. But also, the difference between the northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria is more explained by the farming system or the cropping system. So in the southern Nigeria, the wage is higher, but the farm size is smaller, and also the farming system is more dominantly by the tree crops or root crops. So, but overall, a mixture of these factors seem to explain the variation across the countries. And in Asia, yes, it is true that mechanization kept growing despite the decline in farm sizes. And I think part of the reason is um, mechanization of tractor use for land preparation. So I think part of the factor behind is this, that mechanization is spreading for certain farming operations, but not the whole operations. For example, land preparation has been increasingly mechanized. Tractor use have spread and reached almost 100% in various Asian countries. But the mechanization of the later stages, such as planting, weeding, harvesting, have still remained manual activities. So that explains why the mechanization is the farm size have still remained small. But as I indicated, mechanization, as it affects more fundamental characteristics such as returns to scale, over time, the growth of mechanization will eventually lead to induce some smallholders to exit farming and lead to the increase in average farm size. So those are my responses. Yeah.
Okay, great. So two related questions that kind of build on this questions on adoption. Someone wanted to know about what was the role of the quality and the extent of a good road infrastructure in terms of adoption of mechanization, and could that perhaps explain some of the differences across Asia and Africa? And then someone else wanted to know about the role of social capital in use of mechanization. So do you have any responses to those?
Sure. Yes, I think the role of infrastructure is definitely one factor. I agree with that. Um, I think the good road infrastructure both induce market access, which creates demand for mechanization, and also it increased the mobility of tractors within rural areas. So I think those are consistent with what we have seen. Um, and this, the social capital, I think it's an area that we have yet to fully investigate, but I believe it plays an important role. Um, there are certainly institutional factors in the rural areas that uh, help farmers to communicate with the service providers, and I think that technologies would also complement the presence of the social capital. For example, mobile apps are increasingly, although to a limited extent, increasingly used in African countries, including Nigeria, where a group of farmers request a service through mobile apps, which would be then transferred to booking agencies and communicated to the service providers. So I think it's an important area to research further.
Great. So a couple of other questions. I think these two kind of are geared towards understanding the role of government in the mechanization sector. So one question that came in was, are there countries where the government does not really intervene at all in the markets? There's no distortions at all, or no subsidies, and how is that played out So that's one question. Maybe you can talk about some examples of very liberalized countries. And then another question that's related was whether smallholders in Africa, especially, are when we observe that they're using mechanization more, is that completely without any external help, or are there some programs that are helping to increase their access?
Okay. I think, yeah, I think in several, Asia, there are cases where the growth of mechanization has been associated with increased liberalization. And um, for example, Bangladesh and Vietnam in the 90s are often cited examples. Bangladesh basically moved to liberalized importation of machines such as power tillers and pumping equipments, and and also they even dropped um, requirements to test equipment at that time, if I understand correctly. So, and those were often cited as an example where the mechanization really grew without substantial government intervention. And I think Vietnam is also uh, shifted from more socialist system to more liberalized market-based system in the 90s. And our studies found that during the 90s, they started seeing the growth of power tillers and even the manufacturing of power tillers at that time. So, um, and another recent example is Myanmar, where liberalization have been observed for financial sector, and the bank started lending credit to potential buyers of machines, increasing to a greater extent. But this was combined with some reform on land policies, which provided more security to land use rights. So there were some indirect government intervention, but as far as mechanization sector was concerned, uh, it helped the growth of mechanization in Myanmar seems to happen without significant direct intervention by the government in the last several years. Um, the the second question of mechanization use by smallholders in Africa, I think um, I think there are mixed. In some cases, some programs were supported by the government, um, but we also recognize that by doing the small survey or field work, we observed a significant number of informal sector uh, tractor owner service providers that are actively providing hiring service in various parts of the country, and we they were rarely recognized by the government. So I don't think they are receiving any direct support. They we even had to track them down by talking to different stakeholders to identify them. Some of them are really difficult to track down, so I don't think they are really recognized or supported by the government. So, but oftentimes they invest in tractors using their own personal savings and using the second-hand tractors, and started with using machines on their own farm, but gradually start providing service to neighboring farms. So I think there are several examples like that in the informal sector in Africa.
Great. Hey, I have two questions that came in that are also related, just to understand better the nature of the types of mechanization that you were looking at. So the one actually, the one that has come in was, you talked to, I think we all understand that you definitely were covering mechanization that was helping for crop production. There was a question as to whether you looked at all about mechanization related to small farm irrigation. Some of the, the looking at tube wells and pump sets and so forth. And if not, whether your work or the project would continue and be able to look at that, because that could also be an area for South-South exchange. So that was one question. The other one was actually looking to see if there was, if you could give how much detail that you had on some of this information. There was a question that came in specifically about the case of Nigeria, wondering, what kind of agriculture implements are mainly used by the farmers, what are the, and whether they have demands for other implements that are not currently available if those aren't the ones. So what would they ideally like to have? What are they using at the moment, if you have those details?
Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Our review mostly focused on tractors and in some case combine harvesters, and we didn't spend substantial time on other agriculture machines like tube wells or pump sets, but we often cited that we often mention that in African countries, the in Asia, those tube wells and irrigation related uh, equipment often provided additional use of power tillers and tractors to increase the multifunctionality and the use of these machines. And we recognize that that is lacking in Africa and could be a constraint for farmers' investment in machines. So I think that we see a clear linkage in this, and I think especially for Africa, I, I, I think I agree that it will be important to look at the other mechanization equipment, including tube wells and pump sets in Africa in the future studies. Um, for the question on Nigeria, I think there are one example is going back to tractor. Even for tractors, there are a different demand for different types of tractors, and there are um many used tractors that were imported in the 1980s, which have seemed to disappear mostly, but some of them have somehow survived and continue to be used by farmers. And uh, they often express they like those machines better than the newly introduced tractors by the government. And they face challenges, and because they do not know where to get those tractors from foreign sellers, and also they cannot get spare parts. So um, even for tractors, there are more demand for certain types of tractors, but are not but the government is not supporting those types of access to those types of tractors. So I think those are probably one important example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Let me ask a couple of questions about your policy engagement now, to switch topics just a little bit before we wrap, because we're running out of time.
Sure.
So this was a very interesting action that was taken to bring the African policymakers to Asia. One question is how were they selected, or how were they chosen? Was it by the governments themselves that nominated people, or how was that? That's one question. And in terms of the influence that they've had back home, do you see, is that more of a function of the personality of the person who to take leadership, or is it the position that person has back in the country? If there are any thoughts you have on that, would be welcome. And then finally, a question about policies. That we know that transformation is very high on the African agenda, which means that mechanization would of course be of high interest. But on the other hand, another big topic in Africa is youth employment. And of course, many people think that, well, whenever you bring in capital like machinery, that you might trade off against job growth. So did you sense any kind of concern about that trade-off amongst the policymakers?
Yes, yeah, thank you for all these important questions. Yeah, regarding the selection of officials, the country where they came from were selected mostly because of convenience. I have to admit, we in all those countries except Kenya, we had country office, so it was easier to communicate to the officials through our IFPRI country office programs. And the only example, or the only exception, was Kenya, where they actually reached USAID, and at that time the program was jointly financed by USAID Feed the Future. So that's how we got to know the Kenyan government officials. So yes, the officials who came were also already had some level of close interaction with IFPRI country office. So that's how they were selected. And the actions that were taken afterward, I think there are various factors, and some of them were actually out of the control of of IFPRI. Um, uh, in some case, some officials, we learned that soon after they came back, they had to retire. So it was they were no longer active. But in some other cases, uh, um, they actually came with when they came, they already had a stock of power tillers in the country, but they did not know what to use them for. So the study tour actually helped them to make use of those already available equipment, the stock of equipment already in the country. So so yeah, I would say, I think, yeah, there are a number of factors, and I think, yes, we would like to go deeper into analyzing what affected their actions afterward. And yeah, the youth employment, yes, this is a important area at the government level. As far as I can see, they do not seem the mechanization to be competing with youth employment. Generally, they are interested in promoting both, based on the policy documents that we can see. And um, they also sometimes think that using tractors, for example, for land preparation, then the raising the farm profitability might actually help increase employment for other farming operations, and it might also attract youth to come back to agriculture, where if agriculture is more modernized and capitalized. So yeah, I think, yeah, those are the observations I have.
Yeah, very good points. Do you, maybe just as a follow-up, do you have any, have you started actually looking into that issue with any of your data sets? Is it possible? That's one question. Maybe one, let me squeeze one last one too. We got a couple more at the end. I think we won't be able to get to all of them, but this is another question about the, say, the effects of mechanization. So this is mainly pertaining to South Asia, but is there any evidence that would indicate whether the mechanization has led to any land redistribution or reallocation, in between, say for example, leading to larger land sizes?
Um, sure. Yeah, the first question, yes, yeah, we conducted somewhat related, but not, but slightly different research, but basically identified that generally a higher agricultural productivity led to more employment in both farming and non-farm sector employment, and
Mm-hmm.
also the factor that led to higher agricultural productivity were correlated with factors that are also inducing mechanization. So, yeah, we see some indirect evidence in that. And second point, yeah, that's a very interesting question. We have not started looking into the effects of mechanization on land land market, but I think, yeah, we will definitely look into that, yeah, in the future.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much, Hiro, for your presentation and also for fielding very well all of the questions that came to you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So for those of you who I didn't quite get to your questions, I think there were still a few, and there were some that came in at the last minute as well, I could see. Please feel free to write to Hiro. I think you'll be able to find him on the web on the IFPRI website, but it's h.takeshima@cgir.org. Also, you can find, as we mentioned, you can find the seminar, the slides, if you go to the PIM website, which is http://pim.cgir.org, and you just look under the resource tab and you'll see the webinars, and you can find all the previous webinars as well. And then lastly, just to say, we are currently trying to put together a couple more for this year, so stay tuned, and we'll announce those when they're confirmed. So thank you, everyone.